There is a phrase you have almost certainly heard and almost certainly misunderstood. Not because you weren't paying attention, because everyone misunderstands it in exactly the same direction, and the misunderstanding is almost more comfortable than the truth. The phrase is the banality of evil. Hannah Arendt coined it in 1963, and here is what most people believe it means: that evil is ordinary. That the worst things in human history were done by average people. People like you and me. People with no special capacity for cruelty. People who were just following along. The banality of evil in this reading means that a Holocaust doesn't need monsters, it just needs neighbors. That version has spread so far, so thoroughly, that it's now taught in colleges, repeated in documentaries, cited in political arguments across the entire spectrum. It feels true. It feels like the uncomfortable thing a serious thinker would say. And it is not what Arendt meant. Not even close. What she actually saw was something more specific and far more disturbing. Arendt was born in Germany in 1906. By the time she was 27, she'd been arrested by the Gestapo. She fled to Paris, lived as a stateless person for 8 years, was interned in a French internment camp when France fell in 1940, escaped, and eventually reached the United States in 1941 with almost nothing and no English. She became a U.S. citizen in 1951. That same year, she published The Origins of Totalitarianism, the book that established her as one of the most serious political thinkers of the 20th century. She had survived what she was writing about. She wasn't theorizing from a library. So when Adolf Eichmann, the SS lieutenant colonel who had been the principal organizer of the deportation of European Jews to the death camps, was captured in Argentina in 1960, extradited to Israel, and put on trial beginning April 11, 1961, the New Yorker asked Hannah Arendt to cover it. She agreed, and she went to Jerusalem expecting a monster. She did not find one. What she found, sitting across a glass partition from Eichmann for months, was a man who was, in her words, neither perverted nor sadistic. He was not a fanatic. He did not, as far as she could determine, hate Jewish people in any active burning sense. He was, she wrote, terribly and terrifyingly normal. A bureaucrat. A careerist. A man who had organized the logistics of mass murder the way another man might have organized the logistics of a railway schedule. Not with passion, but with efficiency. And when he was asked, under oath, to explain himself, what came out was not ideology. It was not conviction. It was not the rant of a true believer. What came out was clichés. He told the court he had done his duty. He said he had followed orders and obeyed the law. He said he had always tried to be law-abiding. When pressed for something personal, something that came from inside him, rather than from a manual, he reached for another phrase, another official formula, another borrowed sentence. In Eichmann in Jerusalem, Arendt documented this, the way he deflected every question about his inner life with the language of procedure. She noted that whenever he did try to speak for himself, he became confused, stumbled, and retreated back to cliché. The more one listened to him, she wrote, the more obvious it became that his inability to speak was closely connected with an inability to think, namely, to think from the standpoint of somebody else. He had not stopped being intelligent. He had stopped thinking. That distinction is everything. And it requires a word that does not translate easily. The German word Arendt used, the word she built her entire argument on, is Gedankenlosigkeit. It doesn't mean stupidity. It doesn't mean ignorance. A rough translation would be without thoughtness. The state of a person who has ceased to engage in the internal activity that is thinking. Not because they can't, because they've stopped. In The Life of the Mind, the book she was literally in the middle of writing when she died at her desk in 1975, Arendt describes what thinking actually is. She calls it the two-in-one. It's the internal dialogue you have with yourself, the voice that asks whether what you're doing is right, that imagines how it looks from another standpoint, that refuses to simply ratify what the institution or the superior or the crowd has already decided. That dialogue is conscience. And it is, in Arendt's view, not a luxury or a philosophical hobby. It is the moral faculty. Without it, the human being becomes a relay, receiving instructions, transmitting actions, never asking from the inside whether those actions are something they can live with. Eichmann, in her reading, was not a monster who had suppressed his conscience through evil. He was a man who had, through years of bureaucratic life, through habit, through the comfort of role and rank and procedure, simply stopped thinking in that sense. The internal dialogue had gone quiet, and in its silence, he organized deportations. This is what she meant by the banality of evil. Not that evil is ordinary, not that we're all equally capable of the same things. That a specific mechanism, the replacement of personal moral judgment with role compliance, the silencing of the internal dialogue in favor of external instruction, is available to human beings. That it requires no demonic will to activate. That it requires only the abdication of thinking. Here is the part that should stay with you. Around the same time Arendt was in Jerusalem, a psychologist named Stanley Milgram was running a series of experiments at Yale University. The experiments began in 1961, the same year as the Eichmann trial, and Milgram was explicit about what prompted him. He had read Arendt's reporting. He wanted to know whether ordinary Americans, given the structure of an authority relationship, would administer what they believed to be dangerous electric shocks to another person simply because an authority figure told them to. The results became among the most disturbing in the history of social psychology. Roughly 65% of participants administered what they believed to be the maximum shock level, even as the person on the receiving end screamed, begged, went silent, apparently lost consciousness. They did not do it out of cruelty. Many of them were visibly distressed. Some of them wept. But they kept going. Because the man in the white coat said, in a calm voice, "Please continue." Milgram's conclusion was not that most people are secretly sadistic. His conclusion was that the structure of authority, the role, the lab coat, the official setting, the language of procedure, can override the internal veto. The two in one can be muted, not eliminated. Muted. The moral faculty doesn't disappear. It gets suspended. Arendt did not conduct this experiment. The Milgram research is not her argument. It's a convergence, a piece of documented social science that arrived at a conclusion eerily close to what she had observed across a glass partition in Jerusalem. Together, they describe the same phenomenon from two different angles. And together, they describe something about human beings under institutional authority that should be taken seriously, not dismissed as a history lesson. If you want to read Arendt's words directly, not a paraphrase, not a secondhand summary, but what she actually wrote, I've put something together for exactly this. It's called Dark Times, a quote swipe file with commentary. 50 of her most precise passages, each one with 100 words of plain English context explaining what she meant and why it matters now. Organized by theme: forgiveness, freedom, education, loneliness, action, legacy. The link is in the description. Now, here's the thing about the version of this idea that has actually taken hold in the culture. The evil is ordinary, we're all capable of it version. I want to be fair to it, because it's not entirely wrong. But I want to show you exactly where it fails. The popular version that the Holocaust just needed average people, that any of us might have done the same, does produce a kind of discomfort. But it's a discomfort that quickly converts into something that functions more like absolution than accountability. If everyone would have done it, then individual responsibility dissolves into statistics. If it's the human condition, then it's no one's particular fault. If we're all susceptible, then no one is especially culpable. There's a strange comfort in that. It's the comfort of being part of a majority. Arendt's actual argument does not offer that comfort, because her argument is not about what most people would do in extreme conditions. It's about a mechanism that can be activated or not activated, and that the difference between those who activated it and those who didn't was not genetics or sainthood or unusual courage, but the specific practice of maintaining the internal dialogue, of continuing to think. She documents this in Responsibility and Judgment, a collection of essays she wrote on exactly this question: personal moral responsibility under totalitarianism. Her conclusion is stark. Under conditions of terror, most people will comply. Most, she says, not all. And the fact that some didn't, the fact that resistors existed, that people hid neighbors, that people refused orders, that people said no under conditions where saying no cost them everything, the fact of these people is the proof that the mechanism was not fate. It was a choice. A hard one. A costly one. But a choice. That is more terrifying than the popular version. And more hopeful. Both at once. There is a writer who arrived at something very close to this from a completely different direction. C.S. Lewis in the Screwtape Letters has the senior demon Screwtape describe the ideal patient, the ideal soul being guided toward damnation. And what Screwtape recommends is not grand wickedness. He recommends something much more subtle. He wants the patient to become what he calls a grumbler, a person who, over time, loses the capacity to feel anything genuinely. A person who begins to produce complaints, criticisms, resentments, not from actual feeling but from habit. The grumbler doesn't grumble because they're unhappy. They grumble because it's what they do now. The interiority has been replaced by a function. Lewis and Arendt were writing in different worlds, from different traditions for very different audiences. Lewis was a Christian apologist writing in wartime Britain. Arendt was a secular Jewish refugee writing about totalitarianism. They never discussed each other, as far as the record shows. But the structure they describe is the same. The human being hollowed of genuine interior life, replaced by automatic output, the grumbler. The cliché machine, the man in the dock who, when asked to speak for himself, produced nothing that was his. If you come from a faith tradition, this may land with particular weight. The call to examine your own conscience, what Lewis would call the interior life, what Arendt calls the two-in-one, is not a modern secular invention. It has a long lineage in Christian thought. What's striking is that Arendt, from the entirely opposite direction, arrives at the same insistence. The person who has stopped having a genuine inner life is the person most capable of participating in harm without knowing it. Here is what I need you to sit with, because this is where the argument stops being about 1961 Jerusalem and starts being about your life. The mechanism Arendt identified does not require a Nazi bureaucracy to operate. That is the thing almost no one who quotes this phrase is willing to say plainly. It does not require mass atrocity. It does not require a uniform or an official order. It requires only an institutional context, any institutional context where the external voice of role and procedure becomes louder than the internal voice of judgment. Think about a specific moment. You don't have to name it to anyone. There was a meeting, a board meeting, a church council, a company all hands, a family dinner where something was decided, or said, or allowed to continue. And you knew, somewhere in the part of you that is actually you, and not your role, that it was wrong, not dramatically wrong, not Holocaust wrong, just wrong. And you said nothing. Maybe you told yourself it wasn't your place. Maybe you told yourself it wouldn't matter. Maybe you told yourself you'd address it later, which is what the internal voice sounds like when it's losing. And later never came. I am not describing a monster. I am describing a Tuesday. Arendt's question, the one she was still writing about when she died mid-sentence at her typewriter, was not how did the Germans do it? Her question was, what is the relationship between thinking and morality? What actually happens to a person who keeps the internal dialogue alive? And what becomes available to institutions, to movements, to ordinary harm when that dialogue goes quiet? Her answer is that thinking is not a philosophical luxury. It is a moral act. It is the only act that inserts an individual between the instruction and the compliance. Without it, the relay is complete. When Eichmann in Jerusalem was published in 1963, the reaction from Arendt's own community was fierce. Gershom Scholem, the great Jewish scholar, accused her of lacking Ahavat Israel, love of the Jewish people. He said she wrote about the Holocaust with insufficient sorrow. Her response to him is one of the most honest things she ever wrote. She said, I have never in my life loved any people or collective. I indeed love only my friends, and the only kind of love I know of and believe in is the love of persons. She was not cold. She was precise. And she would not soften her analysis to be embraced by a community that wanted comfort from her instead of thought. She had seen what Eichmann was. She had named it exactly. And when her community, the community she had every reason to want to comfort, every personal reason to want to be beloved by, told her she had gotten it wrong, that her portrait was too sympathetic to a murderer, that her cold analysis showed insufficient heart, she held her ground. She kept thinking. In public. At cost. That is not incidentally related to her argument. That is her argument, lived. The practice she is pointing toward is not easy, and it doesn't come with a guarantee. Arendt does not promise you that maintaining the internal dialogue will change the outcome of any particular meeting, any particular institution, any particular cultural moment. She isn't a self-help writer. She doesn't offer redemptive arcs on schedule. What she offers is the only thing she thinks actually matters. The faculty itself. The capacity to stop, to ask from inside your own conscience rather than from inside your role, whether what is happening is something you can stand behind. Not whether it's permitted, not whether it's expected, whether you can stand behind it. This is harder than it sounds. Institutions are designed in large part to make it easy not to think, to process your role rather than your judgment, to speak the language of procedure rather than the language of conscience. This is not a conspiracy, it's just how organizations function. Procedure is faster, role compliance is smoother. The person who asks the harder question from their own standpoint introduces friction. Arendt is asking you to introduce that friction, not loudly, not performatively, in the private space of the two-in-one. In the moment before you speak or stay silent. In the question, is this coming from my role or from me? In The Life of the Mind, she wrote that it was the absence of thinking, this curious activity that seems so unimportant, that prompted her to investigate the whole question of evil. She came to believe, after Jerusalem, that thinking and morality are inseparable. Not that thinkers are good people, not that philosophy makes you virtuous, but that the specific practice of the internal dialogue, of genuinely asking yourself the question rather than defaulting to what the institution has already answered, is the one mechanism that keeps the relay from completing itself automatically. It doesn't make you safe, it makes you responsible. If you've ever been in a room where something was decided and you knew it was wrong, and you said nothing, tell me what you were afraid of saying. That's not a rhetorical question. I'd like to read your answer. The link to Dark Times, a quote swipe file with commentary, is in the description. 50 of Arendt's most precise passages with plain English commentary, organized by theme. If this video has made you want to hear it from her directly, that's where to start. Dark times call for clear minds.